Hello, creative and crafty people. I hope y'all are doing well today. In this video, I'm going to show you how I created this gorgeous wire wrap Jasper pendant. I will be using a coin-style Jasper stone and trapping it in a copper wire frame. Keep in mind you can use any wire such as silver, gold, or even platinum. There are many different types of wire out there. I use copper for its ease of use and it's the most cost-effective, especially if I'm just practicing. You can also choose whatever type of stone beads you enjoy. Have fun, make it your creation. If you'd like to learn how I did this, then stick around and let's get creating. The materials we need are 20 gauge wire cut at 35.4 centimeters, 18 gauge wire cut at 12.7 centimeters, 20 gauge half round wire cut at 15 centimeters. We'll also need some looping pliers, some chain nose pliers, a pair of flush cutters, a bench block, a chasing hammer, a ring mandrel, a 20mm coin or round Jasper cabochon, and a chain of your choice for your piece. If you missed something in this materials list, you can always go back and rewatch this part of the video, or you can check out the description in this video. Now let's get started on this project. Okay, to get started, we're going to need to grab a piece of our 18 gauge wire that was cut at 12.7 centimeters. And this is our round cabochon. And what we're going to need to do is make a frame for this cab. So the first thing we're going to do is grab our ring mandrel, and we're going to make a circle about the size of that cab. So I'm going to take my wire and wrap it around at about the 9.5 size on my ring mandrel. So I'm going to wrap that wire around, pressing it tightly to the back of that mandrel as I push the ends of that wire down onto the mandrel, like so, making our perfect circle. Now you'll notice this 20mm cab should fit in that size 9.5 ring size perfectly. Just like that. And now, grabbing my chain nose pliers, I'm going to grab one of these wires at the very top where both of those wires intersect in the middle. And I'm going to go slightly to the right on this right side and then straighten my wire up, the tail end of that wire. And then grabbing the other tail end of the wire up against the first wire, I'm going to bend the other one straight up. So these two wires will be directly on top of each other. And again, that cab fits in there perfectly. So now I'm going to press these wires down so that they lay side by side, and that just allows for a little extra room for wire to fit around that frame when I do my wrapping. So to keep it in its place, I'm going to grab my bench block and my chasing hammer, and we're just going to hammer this in place. So here we go, and it also is going to flatten this piece out to give it more of a shine for the light to reflect on. And just some gentle taps, nothing hard. You don't want to smash your wire, you just want to flatten it a bit and harden it. And there we're just making a little adjustment, and there you can see It is all set. And now when I put my cab in there, you could see it's got just a little bit of space all around that stone, and that's what we wanted. Now I'm going to grab my 20 gauge wire cut at 35.4 centimeters, and we're going to take the tail end of this wire and place it over the top of the frame of that upper left hand corner of that circle. And then we're going to bend this wire down and around, and then bring that tail end of the wire back up through the circle, like so. And we're going to create our first wrap around that frame. And then we're going to bring it back up again through the center of our frame, making our second wrap. Two full wraps there. And then with the chain nose pliers, I'm going to press these wraps together and tidy these wraps up. So as you can see, the 20 gauge wire is a little bit thicker, so it's a little bit harder to wrap with your bare hands. So oftentimes I will use the chain nose pliers to help guide me and press those wraps up nice and tight around my frame. Once I get it nice and tight and snug, I will start the next step. So here you can see I'm just pressing that wrap nice and tightly against the frame, so that way these wraps don't move, or this part of the wire don't move around on that frame. And then continue to wrap or tighten those wraps up. And there you can see I'm getting them nice and tight. And see there, I'm not able to move it now. It's nice and tight on that frame. And we're going to tighten up those wraps one more time. And now I'm going to take my flush cutters and we're just going to cut the tail end of this wire off. Like so. Right on the back part of this frame. We want it on the back part, that way we can hide the end of this wrap from showing from the front. And I'm going to again just make sure we get this nice and tight up against our frame, and I'm burnishing that wire down onto the frame. And there you can see there's no movement, it's nice and tight. And so now I'm going to take this wire and I'm going to bend it out toward the side like this. And then we're going to create a loop around to the bottom of this piece. And we're going to continue to go around until we make a nice little circle coming across, back across itself. Like so. So it kind of almost looks like a big fat teardrop. And here we're going to pull it into a circle. And then we want this to be centered, so I'm going to make sure I pull that back over to center it. And there you can see the bottom of this circle comes below the original frame, and there's a reason for this. So we want to make sure there's just that little bit of a gap below the bottom of the frame. Now with my flush cutters, I'm going to cut off the tail end of this wire, and I'm going to cut it at about 1/2 centimeter from the frame, like so. Now I'm going to grab my looping pliers, and I'm going to grab the tail end of that wire with the 3mm barrel of those looping pliers and create a loop going back in toward the center of the circle we just created. I'm going to readjust those looping pliers and grab that loop again, and I'm going to continue to spiral this wire into itself, into the center of that circle. And then you're just going to adjust and play with it until it gets right where you want it. And you don't want to do what I did there, where I just opened the pliers before pulling it out because it misshaped that, but we got it back in place. And again, we're going to make sure this is all nice and centered and adjusted the way I'd like it to look. And there we go. And notice again, the bottom of that spiral is just below the circle of the frame. Now we're just going to rinse and repeat. We're going to do the same thing on the back side of this piece. So grabbing that 20 gauge wire, we're going to go ahead and wrap around the top left side of this circle, which is the back side, but if facing the front, it would be the right side. So now we're going to pull that wire back up through the frame. And there's our first wrap. And bring it back up again. Creating the full second wrap. And again, I'm going to use my chain nose pliers to help me tighten these wraps up. And this just takes a little bit of time. And you want to take your time. You want it to look neat and tidy in the end. And then here we go. We're getting our third wrap up through the center. And up and over, pulling it nice and tight. And then I'm going to grab my flush cutters and just flush cut the end of that wire over the back side of this frame. And then I'm going to push all of these wraps together, nice and tight. And notice that just moves around freely because I have not tightened up my wraps yet. So now I'm going to place it where I want it. And with my chain nose pliers, I'm going to press these wraps nice and tight. And I'm going to follow the wraps around until I get to the tail end of that wire. And that will just press those wires nice and tight up against the frame. And I'm going to do the second side. So again, I'm going to follow that wire around with my chain nose pliers. So see how I just kind of start back and then work my way around. And now that wire's nice and snug and tight. And we're just going to do the same thing, creating our loop on the back of this piece. You're just going to hand form this loop. And we want it to kind of match up with the front one. So a lot of times I will flip it back and forth, seeing where the other one is and making sure that stayed center. Because we want this back piece to kind of line right up with that front piece right in the center where it's supposed to go. And here we're just making little adjustments to match perfectly with the front. And there we are. Now I'm going to grab my flush cutters and cut off at about 1/2 centimeter from the frame once again. Notice my piece just went flying over to the right there. You should always hold onto that piece so you don't shoot your wire across your studio. Now grabbing my looping pliers, I'm going to wrap around that 3mm barrel to make a loop. And then I'm going to readjust my looping pliers, grab to the outside edge of that loop, and then I'm going to spiral inward toward the center of this circle. And there you can see I'm getting that spiral started. And then you want those little inner loops to match up with each other, right centered. So just like that, they are right on top of each other. Now I'm going to take my stone and I'm going to put that right up between these spirals and into that frame. And then when you get it in there, you want to press those spirals down against that stone and right up against the bottom of this frame. You want them all to come together. So see how I've pulled them up together against that frame? Because we need them there for the next step, which is wrapping all 3 of those wires together and closing that stone into this piece. So now I'm going to grab that 20 gauge half round wire and we're going to thread it through with the flat side facing the frames of the wires. And I'm pushing it through about halfway, like so. And then I'm going to take one of those tail ends of the wires and pull it up over the top so I can grab a hold of it with my thumb. And the other one, I'm going to wrap it around all 3 of those wires. So there's one full wrap. And we're going to continue wrapping this until I have about 8 wraps around the bottom, 7 or 8 wraps. So there you can see you want to keep pulling those through nice and snug so they lay up against each other nicely and make sure they're not overlapping each other. And you can use your chain nose pliers to help you in this part. And this half round wire lays nice and flat up against the other wires. So this is the nice thing about the half round. If you don't have half round, you can use regular round, but I would choose to use something like 24 gauge wire rather than the 20 gauge wire to do this part. The 20 gauge half round is definitely smaller and thinner and will wrap easier. So now we're going to take the other end of this half round wire and we're going to wrap it a few more times around the other way. So I basically did 4 wraps going one direction and we'll be doing 4 wraps going the other direction. The amount of wraps doesn't really matter as long as they fit down here. Could be 6 wraps, you can do 8 wraps, you can do however many you want to do. Now I'm going to wrap one more time around here. And this is where things go a little awry for me. The end of that wire just broke right off. That's okay. We can still use it. I'm going to pull that little tail end of the wire really tight. And then I'm going to press all of my wraps up together. Nice and smooth. And this is why I ended up with 7 wraps instead of 8 because my wire broke. But that is okay. We go with the flow of things sometimes. So now I'm going to take my flesh cutters and I'm just going to nip off the tail end of that wire as close to that frame as possible and then burnish that wire down like so. And then we're going to do the same thing on the other side. Making sure my stone is in the right place there and everything is pressed together. I'm going to nip off the end of that wire. And then I'm going to grab my chain nose pliers and burnish the end of that wire down to the frame. So now you can see it's starting to look good here. Now to close in the top of this, we're going to use that 20 gauge wire again. The regular 20 gauge, not the half round. And I'm going to wrap this around those 2 wires coming straight up out of my piece. So again, 20 gauge wire is a little bit more difficult to wrap with, but it can be done. You just need to take your time. Use your chain nose pliers to help you press that wire up around the base wires. And so I'm going to show you that I do struggle sometimes doing these things. So it takes a little bit of time. So here you can see I'm trying to press that wire. My pliers want to slip off the wire. And there we've got the one side pressed down a bit. I'm going to go ahead and press it down some more. if I can get it to stay in place where I want it to. And there we go. Now we're getting it in place. So now I'm going to grab the longer tail end of this wire and start wrapping it around like so. And we're going to wrap it around those two wires that are going to create our bail. We're going to wrap it around 3 times. And then I'm going to press all of these down against those 2 base wires, making sure the wraps are nice and together. And then pulling that wire back up just a little bit so I can get my flush cutters underneath. I'm going to flush cut right in the center of the 2 of those wires facing the back side. And then I'm going to burnish the tail end of that wire down onto those 2 base wires, like so. Then we're going to do the same thing with the other tail wire there, the other end. So I'm pulling it back up so I can get my flush cutters up under there. And we want that wire to come right across the middle of those 2 base wires. Now after flush cutting that off, I'm going to take my chain nose pliers and I'm going to burnish that wire up against those 2 base wires. And that will also tighten those wraps completely down so they don't move. And we're going to make sure the wraps are all pressed up against each other, nice and neat. Like so. Making sure the front of this is nice and neat and tidy as well. And there we are. And now we're going to make our bail. So we're going to take the top of these 2 base wires, grabbing our chain nose pliers, we're going to bend those wires forward at about a 45-degree angle, like so. And then grabbing our looping pliers at the 4mm barrel, we're going to wrap around that 4mm barrel, both of those wires back toward the back of the piece, like so. And then once those wires touch the back of the piece, we're going to readjust the looping pliers just slightly. And then we're going to splay those 2 wires apart, like so, at the back of the piece. And then we're going to take each of those wires and push them around that 4mm mandrel. So I'm going to continue to wrap around with both of those wires. Like so, and making sure they're nice and tight up against that 4mm mandrel and not around the mandrel up above, like so. And then we're going to flush cut the ends of these wires so that the ends will butt up against themselves in that little loop. So again, we're going to make sure we flush cut. We want the flat side to hit the other part of that loop. And there you can see we've got the finished pendant. And this is the front of the piece, and there's the back of the piece. Now I'm going to add my chain to the piece. I'm using some oxidized copper chain that I already have. I put these together myself, and I'm going to go ahead and thread it through the right side of my piece to come out the left side. The reason I do that is so that the bail ends up on the right side. Most people are right-handed. If you have a left-handed client, or if you're left-handed yourself, you could thread it the opposite way. And here's the finished pendant. I hope y'all enjoyed watching this video. Let me know in the comments below what you thought. Also, don't forget to give me a thumbs up. This just lets YouTube know that you like my content, and YouTube will push these videos out to even more creative people like yourself. If you haven't already and you'd like to see more of my tutorials, then click that subscribe button. It's free, and it'll just let you know when a new tutorial is up for you to view. Thank you guys for your continued support. I sure do appreciate you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next Thursday.